Chapter 18, the Druses. The Druses, as aforestated, are a Gnostic sect among the Ismailite Mohammedans. It was founded in the 10th century during the reign of the Fatimite Caliph al-Hakim Bi'am Bilalu. The founder is usually recognized as Muhammad al-Darazi or al-Druzi. Born near Bokhara, circa 960, he adopted the doctrine then preached by al-Hakim of the successive reincarnations of the divinity under human form, and wrote a treatise in which he established a continuous series of divine incarnations, ending with the statement that the last living manifestation was al-Hakim, the Caliph of Egypt. So pleased was al-Hakim with the book that he called Muhammad al-Druzi to him and gave him great authority in the conduct of affairs. From that time, al-Hakim, who hitherto had been known as Bi'am Bilalu, that is, the one governing by the order of God, changed his name to Bi'am-e, meaning the one governing by his own right. He then caused himself to be worshipped as God. The public reading of Muhammad al-Druzi's book in one of Cairo's mosques caused popular riots, and its author was obliged to flee from Egypt. He took refuge in the mountains of Syria and made many proselytes by allowing his adepts the use of wine, condoning licentiousness, and encouraging the propagation of ideas tending to the confiscation of property. Later he returned to Egypt, but was confronted by the power gained by one of his disciples, Hamza al-Hadi, who had become leader of the Druses there. In the conflict that ensued, Muhammad al-Druzi took up arms against his rival and adversary and was killed in 1019. Hamza later went to Syria and Lebanon and preached to the Druses the doctrine of al-Hakim such as prevailed in Egypt. Hamza was declared the prophet, the Imam of al-Hakim, who, being the divine incarnation, will yet manifest himself to the Druses, be their Messiah, and give them all earthly power. The sect is divided into 3 degrees: profanes, aspirants, and wise. The Druses, from the political point of view, are divided into 2 parts: the Jumblatis and the Yezbikis. And religiously they have their own rites, mysteries, and exotic and esoteric doctrines. The high initiates or priests rule the people, and through religious fanaticism have reduced the Druses to a state of theocracy with all its attendant law of fear and numerous restrictions upon which theocratic power can alone be edified. In his book, The Secret Societies, Hecathorn comments on the similarity existing between the law of the Druses and that of the Jews, whereby to a brother perfect truth and confidence are due, but it is allowable, nay, a duty, to be false towards men of another creed. Subsequently, he draws yet another comparison between the Druses and the Freemasons, and mentions the Masonic degrees of the United Druses and Commanders of Lebanon. Chapter 19, the Assassins. The Judeo-Shia sect of the Assassins, or Hashishims, were founded in 1090 by Hassan Sabah, a Persian who had been initiated into Ismailism at Cairo in the household of the Fatimite Caliph al-Mustansir. He was known as the Old Man, or rather the Lord of the Mountain. His influence in Egypt having excited the envy of many, he was sent into exile. Caliph al-Mustansir's vizier was a Jew named Abu Mansur Sadaqah ibn Yusuf, under whose protection Hassan traversed Persia as a missionary, preaching and making proselytes, and having seized the fortress of Alamut on the borders of Iraq and Dilim, which he called the House of Fortune, he there established his rule. The history of his time is full of his name. Kings in the very center of Europe trembled at it. His powerful arm reached everywhere. According to Hecathorn, he reduced the 9 degrees into which the adherents of the Lodge Cairo were divided to 7, placing himself at the head, with title of Seydna or Sidna, whence the Spanish Cid and the Italian Signore. The term assassins is a corruption of hashishism, derived from hashish, Indian hemp, with which the chief intoxicated his followers when they entered on some desperate enterprise. To regulate the 7 degrees, he composed the catechism of the order. The first degree recommended to the missionary attentively to watch the disposition of the candidate before admitting him to the order. The second impressed it upon him to gain the confidence of the candidate by flattering his inclinations and passions. The third to involve him in doubts and difficulties by showing him the absurdity of the Quran. The fourth to exact from him a solemn oath of fidelity and obedience, with a promise to lay his doubts before his instructor. And the fifth to show him that the most famous men of church and state belonged to the secret order. The sixth, called confirmation, enjoined on the instructor to examine the proselyte concerning the whole proceeding course, and firmly to establish him in it. The seventh, finally, called the exposition of the allegory, gave the keys of the sect. The followers were divided into 2 great hosts, self-sacrificers and aspirants. The first, despising fatigues, dangers, and tortures, joyfully gave their lives whenever it pleased the master, who required them either to protect himself or to carry out his mandates of death. According to the legend, the man selected by the Lord to perform the dangerous exploit was first made drunk, and in this state carried into a beautiful valley where he was, on waking, surrounded by a lovely, sylph-like woman who made him believe he was in Elysium. But ere he wearied or became satisfied with love and wine, he was once more made drunk, and in this state carried back to his own home. When his services were required, he was again sent for by the Lord, who told him that he had once permitted him to enjoy paradise, and if he would do his bidding, he could luxuriate in the same delights for the rest of his life. The dupe, believing that his master had the power to do all this, was ready to commit whatever crime was required of him. Several Christian princes were suspected of conniving at the deeds of the assassins. Richard of England is one of them, and it has been the loyal task of English writers to free him from the charge of having instigated the murder of Conrad de Montferrat. There also existed for a long time a rumor that Richard had attempted the life of the King of France through Hassan and his assassins. The nephew of Barbarossa, Frederick II, was excommunicated by Innocent II for having caused the Duke of Bavaria to be slain by the assassins. And Frederick II, in a letter to the King of Bohemia, accuses the Duke of Austria of having, by similar agents, attempted his life. The corruption of the Order of the Templars, which brought about its downfall, has been imputed by most historians to this sect, which was suppressed in 1256 when the Mongolians, led by Prince Hulagu, attacked and overthrew them. Chapter 20. The Knights Templar. The first Knights Templar order, founded in 1118 by Hugh de Payens, had 13 degrees. So has its modern successor. These are the Blue degrees: first, entered apprentice; second, fellow craft; third, master mason. The chapter degrees: 4, mark mason; 5, past master; 6, most excellent master; 7, royal arch; 8, royal master; 9, select master; 10, super excellent master; 11, Knights of the Red Cross; 12, Knights Templar; 13, Knights of Malta. It is chronicled that several of the founders of the Templar order were initiates in this sect of the assassins. Blanchard, writing of it, says, "During the Middle Ages, the most eminent warriors and noble men of Europe entered its ranks. The Knights of the Temple became the bulwark of the Holy Land against the Saracens. France, England, and other countries formed associations, priories of Templar Knights, each with its own Grand Master and other officers. Such great wealth was accumulated in the treasuries of the order that in the year 1185 its annual income represented a sum equal to $30 million. The Templars were bankers and loaned money on their own terms, but wealth and prosperity naturally led to licentiousness, neglect of Templar law, and in the end destruction. Having embraced Gnosticism while in Palestine, one moment please, I have to do something. I'm sorry for the interruption. Having embraced Gnosticism while in Palestine and in touch with the sect of assassins, the Templar order degenerated, and some of its members, under the influence of that sect, were said to practice phallicism, or sex worship, and Satanism, and to venerate the Baphomet, the idol of the Luciferians. The crime of sodomy was a rite of Templar initiation. It is here interesting to note that the phallus holds the lowest rank in the Brahmin theology, for in countries where people are virtually enslaved by superstition, this kind of hearsay is useful to the ruling classes. Morris thus summarizes the fall of the Templars. In the year 1307, the Grand Master of the Order, Jacques de Molay, was arrested in Paris with 60 of his knights and imprisoned upon charges of idolatry and other crimes. Shortly afterward, all the Knights Templar in France were put in prison in Paris. May 12, 1310, 54 of them were burnt alive. March 18, 1314, the Grand Master, with 3 of his most eminent officers, suffered in like manner. The great possessions of the order were now confiscated, and the society suppressed both by the Pope and the leading monarchs of Europe. In England, the Knights Templar were dissolved in the reign of Edward II, and after the grant of their properties of the Knights Hospitallers, these in their turn were dissolved by Henry VIII. After the death of Molay, the Knights Templar found a protector in King Denis II of Portugal, who reformed the order in 1317 under the name Knights of Christ. A complete bibliography of literature, both in print and in manuscript, dealing with the subject of the Knights Templar has been compiled by Monsieur de Sabray, and the student is referred to his book, Bibliography of the Order of Templars. Chapter 21. The Knights of Malta. The Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, or Hospitallers of St. John, afterward called the Knights of Rhodes and finally Knights of Malta, were founded about the commencement of the Crusades as a military and religious order. Well, there's not much said of them. That was kind of it. It was just a paragraph. So we'll go on. Chapter 22, the Rosicrucians. Speculation has been rife as to the origin of the Rosicrucians, and the many fables and legends connected with the subject, but have little historical value, owing to the great discrepancy between the information contained in the following article and that given in the more modern editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. It has been deemed advisable to reprint the former. Rosicrucians, a name assumed by a sect or cabal of hermetical philosophers who arose, as it has been said, or at least became first taken notice of in Germany in the beginning of the 14th century. They bound themselves together by a solemn secret, which they all swore inviolably to preserve, and obliged themselves, at their admission into the order, to a strict observance of certain established rules. They pretended to know all sciences, and chiefly medicine, whereof they published themselves the restorers. They pretended to be masters of abundance and important secrets, and, among others, that of the philosopher's stone, all which they affirmed to have received by tradition from the ancient Egyptians, Chaldeans, the Magi, Gymnosophists. They have been distinguished by several names accommodated to the several branches of their doctrine. Because they pretend to protect the period of human life by means of certain nostrums, and even to restore youth, they were called immortals. As they pretended to know all things, they have been called Illuminati, and because they have made no appearance for several years, unless the sect of Illuminated, which lately started up on the continent, derives its origin from them, they have been called the Invisible Brothers. The society is frequently signed by the letters FRC, which some among them interpret Frater Roris Cocti, it being pretended that the matter of the philosopher's stone is concocted, exalted, etc. Some who are no friends of Freemasonry make the present flourishing society of Freemasons a branch of Rosicrucians, or rather the Rosicrucians themselves, under a new name or relation, as retainers to building, and it is certain that there are some Freemasons who have all the characters of Rosicrucians, but how the era and original of Masonry and that of Rosicrucianism here fixed from Nadeus, who has written expressly on the subject conflict, we leave others to judge. Notwithstanding the pretended antiquity of the Rosicrucians, it is probable that the alchemists, Paracelsus, and fire philosophers, who spread themselves through almost all Europe about the close of the 16th century, assumed about this period the obscure and ambiguous title of Rosicrucian Brethren, which commanded at first some degree of respect, as it seemed to be borrowed from the arms of Luther, which were a cross placed upon a rose. But the denomination evidently appears to be derived from the science of chemistry. It is not compounded, says Mothiam, as many imagine, of the two words rosa and crux, which signify the rose and cross, but of the latter of these words, and the Latin rose, which signifies dew, and the head of these fanatics was Robert Flood, an English physician, Jacob Beeman, and Michael Meyer. But if rumor may be credited, the present illuminated have a head of higher rank. The common principles, which serve as a kind of center of union to the Rosicrucian society, are the following. They all maintain that the dissolution of bodies by the power of fire is the only way by which men can arrive at true wisdom, and come to discern the first principles of things. They all acknowledge a certain analogy and harmony between the powers of nature and the doctrines of a religion, and believe that the deity governs the kingdom of grace by the same laws with which he rules the kingdom of nature, and hence they are led to use chemical denominations to express the truth of religion. They all hold that there is a sort of divine energy or soul diffused through the frame of the universe, which some call the ergus, others the universal spirit, and which others mention under different appellations. They all talk in the most superstitious manner of what they call the signatures of things, of the power of the stars over all corporal beings and their particular influence upon the human race, of the efficacy of magic and the various ranks and orders of demons. These demons they divide into two orders, sylphs and gnomes. This article, having been written in 1747, only hinted at what the Rose Croix might have been. Subsequent research upon the organization of the fraternity, its tenets, and its achievements shows it to have been a medium for the propagation of Gnosticism and a center for political activities. Before it conquered Freemasonry, which was officially instituted in 1717, many names were already associated intimately with this esoteric organization. Among others were Faustus Socinius, Cesare Cremonini, Michael Meyer, Valentin Andrea, Thomas Vaughan, Philalites, Charles Blount, Frederick Helvetius, Richard Simon, and Theophilus Desaguliers. It is claimed that Faustus Socinius, named after Faustus, the Manichae, nephew of Laelius Socinius, whose teacher was Camillo Renato, was an intimate of Rosicrucianism and founder of the Socinians. Catholics and Protestants alike opposed Faustus Socinius in his efforts to graft a secret cult on the existing Orthodox religions, and in 1598 the people of Cracovia, revolted by his doctrines, pillaged his house, burned his books and manuscripts, and almost massacred their author. He had sworn hatred to the Church and bruised himself in founding an association, the arms of which were to be subversive to all its teachings, and 2 years before his death he was obliged to take refuge from his enemies with one Abraham Blonsky. The membership of the Rose Crow was composed of alchemists, astrologers, and spiritists, whose quest was the search for a process for transmuting base metals into gold and the secret of life. The most of these generation was the root principle of alchemy. To most of these generation was the root principle of alchemy. The order of the Rose Crow revealed itself in 1614 with the appearance of 2 books, Fama Fraternitas and Confessio, attributed to Valentin Andrea, giving the legend of the travels of Christian Rosenkreuz. According to Charles T. McClanahan, 33-degree historian, Grand Lodge, State of New York, this same legend had appeared as the work of Raymond Lully, who died in 1315. In this legend, translated into English in 1616 by Robert Flood, a symbolic personage called Christian Rosenkreuz, destined to live 106 years on earth, traveled in the East where he studied the Kabbalah, and on his return to his native Germany, he revealed to 3 disciples the secret of secrets, the great secret of theosophy. Finally, he retired to a cave to finish his days in solitude, dying in 1484 at the age of 106. His disciples came, enshrouded him, and disappeared. His grave was to be unknown for 6 times 26 years, at the end of which period it was to become the hearth of the light, destined to illuminate the world at the time appointed by God. In 1604, chance brought men to this cave. On entering, great was their surprise to find it resplendent with bright light. It contained an altar, bearing upon the copper plate the inscription, "Living, I reserve this light for my grave." One mysterious figure was accompanied by this epigram, "Never vacant." A second figure, "The yoke of the law." A third figure, "The liberty of the Gospels." A fourth, "The glory of the whole God." The hall still contained lamps burning without fuel, mirrors of various shapes and box. Upon the wall was written, "In 6 times 20 years I will be discovered." The prophecy was fulfilled, adds the fable by way of conclusion. There's a footnote. Fire, when fire was mentioned, that is meaning Kundalini, and also known as the sex force, which was mentioned like in the belief of the Rosicrucians. So now we go on. I'm sorry, I kind of took a break there. We'll go on. I'm going to take a short drink. Okay. Page 152. The movement was greatly furthered by the impulse given it when, after the appearance of the Fama Fraternitas and Confessio, a German alchemist, Michael Meyer, an English physician, Robert Flood, and a pietist, Julius Sperber, wrote treatises in defense or explanation of the Order of the Rose Crow. It has repeatedly been stated that Michael Meyer, Michael Meyer, who frequently visited England, was a friend of Robert Fludd. He was the author of Themis Aurea and Silentium Post Clamores, both Rosicrucian works. His political influence may be judged from his career. Physician to Rudolph II, he was created by him Count of the Palatinate and acted as an advisor to his sovereign. In 1609, Rudolph II issued an imperial charter granting religious liberty to the Moravians. Masonic authorities state that Meyer, as a Rosicrucian, changed his official title to Summus Magister, a sovereign master, which is that used by all his successors and borne by the principal Socinian Rose-Croix documents dating from the time of Faustus Socinius to that of Johann Wolf, which are preserved in the Sovereign Patriarchal Council of Hamburg, that is the supreme Jewish lodge secretly affiliated to international Masonry. In his book Themis Aurea, written in 1616 and 1617 and printed in 1618, Maya, the Grand Master, refers to a resolution passed at a meeting in 1617 in which it was formally agreed that the Brotherhood of the Rose-Croix must maintain the strictest secrecy for 100 years. On October 31st, 1617, the convention of the seven at Magdeburg had indeed agreed to qualify its members during the ensuing 100 years of secrecy as the Invisibles. It had renewed its oath to destroy the Church of Jesus Christ and had decreed that in the year 1717 it would transform the fraternity into an association which could carry on a more or less open propaganda while adopting such measures as prudence as might then be deemed expedient by the leaders of the sect. Finally, the seven adopted definitely, as being sufficiently original to appeal to popular imagination, Valentin Andreas' curious story of the Rose-Croix, which had been secretly printed in Venice towards 1613. Robert Fludd was the author of Tractatus Apologeticus and Clavis Philosophiae et Alchemiae. He was greatly helped in the foundation of the Rose-Croix order in England by Francis Bacon, author of Nova Atlantis. Valentin Andrea, to whom, as we have seen, are ascribed the works Fama and Confessio, as well as Chemical Nuptials, had in 1640 been appointed preacher of the Duke of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, who was soon to make him his chaplain. To those who know the important part played by the Duke of Brunswick during the French Revolution, this entrance of the Brunswick family into the sect is very interesting. As a Rosicrucian, Andrea was the teacher of Comenius, Amos Kaminsky, who frequently visited England during his mysterious political career. Bishop of the Moravian community, Comenius was the leader of the Moravian Brethren, a sect pledged to achieve the extermination of the Catholic Church and which, being considered heretical, was also suspected of practicing secret Satanism. The Moravians were imbued with Socinianism, and that is the doctrine of Lelius Socinius, which had been spread among them by his nephew Faustus Socinius, who had found refuge in the Moravia when persecuted by the Church. Their link with Rosicrucianism had already been established in the person of the pietist Julius Sperber, who was also one of their leaders. When Kominsky was persecuted, he first went to London in 1641, and early the next year went to Sweden, where he was granted refuge and help by the powerful Swedish minister Count Axel Oxenstierna, himself a Rosicrucian, adept and protector of another initiate, Ludwig van Geer from Holland. The combination of the pursuit of alchemy and Hermeticism with political aims was frequently evidenced even before the official appearance of Rosicrucianism. The influence of adepts and the destines of nations was immense. To Queen Elizabeth, the advice of John Dee, her alchemist, was always considered in matters affecting national policy, and to Dee, his crystal gazer Edward Kelly was indispensable as a medium. Ludwig von Gehr, one of the 7 present at Magdeburg, had settled in Sweden and had won over the Chancellor, Count Axel Oxenstern, then the real regent, in view of the minority of Queen Christina, a great industrialist of Dutch birth with a colossal fortune made in the manufacture of cannon. He had become a baron, and as owner of 20 ships of the Swedish fleet, he was an indispensable man. Another striking Rosicrucian figure was Thomas Vaughan, Eugenius Philalitz, not to be confused with his pupil George Starkey, known as Irenaeus Philalitz. It is said that it was Thomas Vaughan who, inspired by the writings of Nick Stone, conceived the idea of subverting to the ambition of the sect to which he belonged the Guild of the Freemasons, which, owing to its universal character, lent itself better than any other to the realization of this project. This goes on pretty far. Nick Stone was one of the 7 of the Convention of Magdeburg. As an architect belonging to the Guild of the Freemasons, he had helped Inigo Jones, the Grand Master of the English lodges, which at this period were non-sectarian. On the other hand, as a Rosicrucian, he had grasped the Luciferian sense, the idea given by Faustus Socinus, and he had composed for the 9 grades of the fraternity rituals with which the chiefs declared remarkable. His ritual of the 8th degree, Magistra Templi, was really satanic. Thomas Vaughan, struck by these manuscripts, wondered whether it would be possible to extend the teaching of the Rose Croix to all accepted Masons, who were then admitted to the lodges in an honorary capacity. The Freemasons received in their guild, under the name of accepted Masons, peers and men of letters or professional men, as well as rich bourgeois, who enhanced the brilliancy of their meetings and patronized their entertainments. These honorary members were their protectors and benefactors. Vaughan believed that this element, gifted with certain intellectual qualities, would lend itself better to the propagation of the principles of occult socialism than the workers of the fellow craft, and having made up his mind that this was the solution of the problem, he hastened to put it into practice. Let's see how many more pages we have to go, because I'm going to take a quick I'm starting to speak German. Because when I get tired, that's what I do. I mix my languages. Sorry. I'll go on. Some brothers of the Rose Croix were already mingling with the Freemasons. Among the members of the Warrington Lodge were Richard Penkett, James Collier, Richard Sankey, Henry Littler, John Elam, and Hugh Brewer, and in London the Whartons and their friends had slipped into the lodge as accepted Masons. Thomas Vaughan encouraged them to spread the principles of Socinius. Finally, at a meeting on the 14th of May in 1643, he announced that their desultory efforts at restrained proselytizing should be supplanted by a definite program of entering the guild lodges with the object of using them as instruments to an end. The account of this meeting of the 14th May 1643 is given in full in the Memoirs of Philalitus, and the whole plan of Freemasonry of today is therein revealed. So blended are truth and fiction in the active career of this adventurous adept that Vaughan must always remain one of the most mysterious characters of Rosicrucianism. When the plague of 1665 drove the court from London to Oxford, Thomas Vaughan went thither with his patron, the king, and a little later took up his residence with the rector of Albury, the Reverend Sam Kem, at whose house on February 27th of that year he was killed by an explosion in the course of chemical experiments. His work in Freemasonry, however, has remained as his monument. Together with Elias Eschmoll, pupil of Rabbi Solomon Frank and the protege of James Paget, Thomas Vaughan worked up the Masonic system of the first 3 degrees. These degrees, those of entered apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason, were devised for the temptation of the masses, while outside and above them continued the former secret system of the Rose Cross, 4 degrees of which belonging to the gold cross were known as first Celator, second Theoricus, third Practicus, and fourth Philosophus, teaching merely the principles of alchemy, while the degrees of the Rose Cross were 5th Adeptus Minor, 6th Adeptus Major, 7th Adeptus Exemptus, 8th Magister Templi, and 9th Magus. Contemporaneous with the evolution of free thought against revealed religion, broke the revolution against civil authority, plunging England into the throes of the Civil War. Oliver Cromwell was successful at the head of the Parliament troops, while Charles I was everywhere betrayed by men on whom he relied. Henry Blount was among the traitors accruing to Cromwell after the Battle of Edgehill. At least the defeat of the king was his pretext, for treason was everywhere premeditated. The word of order was given by the Rose Cross, which had spread rapidly among the Puritans. The year 1644 ended with the destruction of the royal power, and February 9th, 1649, the day on which the head of Charles I fell at Whitehall, consummated its ruin. The royal power had in fact been wrecked when the troops of Parliament were victorious, when the Queen was obliged to take refuge in France, when the Prince Palatine Robert had been defeated, when York had been taken, and when the Commons had obtained against Laud, the Protestant Episcopal Bishop of London, Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bill of Attainder, which declared him guilty of the crime of treason. Laud had stood for resistance to the Puritans. Okay, I'm going to stop for the moment and take a break. Continued on page 158, Occult Theocrasy. The connection of the Cromwell family with that of the celebrated Thomas Cromwell, Earl of Essex, whose political ideas, formed in Italy under the guidance of Machiavelli, had so greatly affected the trend of English history, is here not devoid of interest. In 1767, a document was discovered which revealed the existence of a society of Freemasons in Italy with about 64,000 members. The document said, "At last the great mine of the Freemasons of Naples is discovered, of whom the name but not the secret was known. 2 circumstances are alleged by which the discovery was brought about. A dying man revealed all to his confessor, that he should inform the king thereof. A knight who had been kept in great state by the society, having had his pension withheld, betrayed the Grand Master of the order to the king. This Grand Master was the Duke of San Severo. The king secretly sent a confidential officer with 3 dragoons to the Duke's mansion, with orders to seize him before he had time to speak to anyone, and bring him to the palace. The order was carried out, but a few minutes after, a fire broke out in the Duke's mansion, destroying his library, the real object being, as is supposed, to burn all writings having reference to Freemasonry. The fire was extinguished and the house guarded by troops. The Duke, having been brought before the king, openly declared the objects, system, seals, government, and possessions of the order. He was sent back to his palace, and there guarded by troops, lest he should be killed by his former colleagues. Freemasons have also been discovered at Florence, and the Pope and the Emperor have sent thither 24 theologians to put a stop to the disorder. The king acts with greatest mercy towards all implicated to avoid the great dangers that might ensue from a contrary course. He has also appointed 4 persons of great standing to use the best means to destroy so abominable a sect, and has given notice to all the other sovereigns of Europe of his discovery and the abominable maxims of the sect, calling upon them to assist in its suppression, which it will be folly in them to refuse to do. For the order does not count its members by thousands, but by millions, especially among Jews and Protestants. Their frightful maxims are only known to the members of the 5th, 6th, and 7th lodges, whilst those of the first 3 know nothing, and those of the 4th act without knowing what they do. They derived their origin from England, and the founder of the sect was the infamous Cromwell, first bishop and then lover of Anne Boleyn, and then beheaded for his crimes. Called in his day the scourge of rulers, he left the order an annual income of £10,000 sterling. It is divided into 7 lodges. The members of the 7th are called assessors, of the 6th grand masters, of the 5th architects, of the 4th executors. Here the secret ends. Of the 3rd ruri cori, of the 2nd and 1st novices and proselytes. Their infamous idea, based on the allegory of the Temple of Solomon, considered in its first splendor, and then overthrown by the tyranny of the Assyrians, and finally restored, thereby to signify the liberty of man after the creation of the world, the tyranny of the priesthood, kings, and laws, and the re-establishment of that liberty. As for Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, there is no record of his having been an accepted Mason. He was, however, on the best of terms with Richard Penkett, and is supposed by many to have been secretly affiliated to the Rosicrucians, but whether an adept or not, he served the purpose of the sect, destruction of the royal and ecclesiastical Christian power. After the death of Charles I, Cromwell appointed an assembly of lawyers and divines to consider the petition of Manasseh ben Israel, 1604 to 1657, demanding the abolition of the legal exclusion of the Jews from England. In December 1655, the legal prohibition was removed. 11 years after, 1666, occurred the Great Fire of London. Thus the following letter helps to solve the mystery of this historical disaster. It was one of many written by the secretary-interpreter of the Marquis de Louvois, an English spy, to his chief in England, published in London in 1697 by D. Jones, Gent. Of the firing of the city of London in 1666. My lord, I am fully satisfied by what I have both seen and heard at Paris and elsewhere, that the Duke of York was in the year 1666 brought quite over to the French interest, and I have heard strange stories related concerning his conduct at the time of the dreadful conflagration of the city. Looking upon it Janus-like, with one face seeming concerned for the lamentable disaster, and with the other rejoicing to see that noble pile reduced to ashes, and its citizens ruined, who had at all times been the greatest propagators for liberty and property, and opposers of that religion which he now not only secretly protest, but was even ready publicly to own, and rewarding those incendiaries at St. James, who then were suspected generally to be Frenchmen, as your lordship well may remember. But by our minutes it does appear they were not such, but they were persons, at least many of them, set on work by French councils, and such as at that time were of all men least suspected. I mean Jews, of which they had then several in pay, not only in England, but all over Christendom, not only to give them intelligence in which they are wondrous active, but likewise to promote and act the worst of mischiefs, as which they make no balk. By these fires have been kindled not only in England, but in Germany, Poland, and elsewhere, which the Germans imputed to Turkish emissaries, though they were Jews hired with French money. The Turkish policy not being so refined in mischief, these sorts of Jews put on the shape of what Christians they pleased, and of this sort employed by France they were and are still several in England, the name of one or two of which I think I shall be able to give your lordship in some time, though they go by several, as time and occasion doth require, and so at present I remain. My lord, your lordship's humble servant, Paris, April 6, 1676. More shadows of the past, more strange suggestions to shake the foundations of our belief in things as they seem. The last of the Grand Masters of the Rosicrucians was Johann Christian Wolff. Masonry, which was a secret association, had maintained its existence for years, had uncovered itself and become an avowed organization with the proclamation of the Anderson Constitution. Once in the open, it was to be universal screen behind which all secret societies, whether theurgic or political, would operate clandestinely. Masonry, with its proclamation of 3 philanthropic and altruistic degrees, with no apparent real secret, declaring itself Christian and non-political, would become the center in which ignorant men, recruited and duped, could act like puppets animated by unseen hands pulling unseen strings. Thus it came about that all blows dealt to Christianity and states were prepared by the secret societies acting behind the veil of Masonry. Okay, one drink, one moment. Chapter 23, the Cathares, Albigenses, Waldenses. Manichaeism, with its hierarchy and missionary system, had taken root in Europe, and, with its chief seat in Bulgaria, had thus found its way into northern Italy and southern part of France. Unquestionably, Manichaeans, in their beliefs and teachings, the Cathares, purifiers or pure, held the unadulterated tradition of Manes. Their hierarchy was that established by their founder. In the 12th century, their supreme chief was in Bulgaria, having under him bishops, priests, deacons, and simple prefects. These composed the class of prefects who were distinguished from the second degree of believers. As to the Albigenses, their name derived from Albi, a town of Languedoc, covered not one but many sects issued from Manichaeism and Arianism, and counted also many Jews or Judaized Christians. Under this appellation of Albigenses, historians, whether political or religious, have almost unanimously included the Cathares. I'm sorry. Cathares. Okay, never mind. A revolt against the then existing church power of the 12th century is only too comprehensible when one recollects the excesses of which popes, bishops, almost all dignitaries of the church were guilty. The pioneers of the rebellion had been Peter of Bruys, died 1126, and the monk Henri, died 1148. They had openly attacked the vices of the clergy and fallen victims. The first of his own fanaticism, he was killed by the mob whose anger he had aroused by pulling down a wooden cross to be used as burning wood for the purpose of cooking meat on a Good Friday. The second was imprisoned by a bishop against whose vice he had raised his voice. Both had attacked the beliefs and practices of the church. Like the Baptists of today, they rejected the practice of baptism for children and denied the dogmas of transubstantiation and redemption through Christ. They gained many adherents and left numerous disciples whose Manichaean opposition to the church was identical with that of the Cathares. Upon such grounds fell the preaching of Peter Waldo, who, although he repudiated the dualist doctrine of the Manichaeans, formed a serious opposition to the church. He created the sect of the Waldenses, divided into 2 degrees, perfect and believers. The former made the vow of poverty, and as such took the names of poor brethren. The latter formed the outer or third order. From the south of France and northern Italy, persecution drove the Waldenses to the central and northern provinces of France, thence to England, then from Lombardy into Germany and Bohemia. John Wycliffe, 1324 to 1384, in England, and John Huss, 1369 to 1415 in Bohemia, were their foremost representatives, and in the latter country they formed the Bohemian Brethren, who later also took the name of Moravian Brethren, or Religious Masons. Okay, I think I'm going to stop for today. That was chapter 23. Next time we'll go to chapter 24, the Moravians.